these are mere facts. Basically, this was something that was argued long before. But unfortunately, actually, the paradigm that was prevailed and the conventional wisdom was that nobody could actually forge a normalization treaty between Israel and Arab states unless there is kind of a comprehensive peace treaty between Israel and Palestinians. Well, this tends to argue the opposite. And this is why I think that 2020 is not only a year to be remembered for the coronavirus and the pandemic, but also for, I would say, sort of a breakthrough, which I do believe and hope that would, in my opinion, actually create kind of a different climate in the Middle East. Once again, this is not a winning formula. Challenges still lie ahead. But when you are having a look at the whole pie, the Middle Eastern pie, there are some Arab quarters who are breaking with tradition. What they are coming up with is something which is unheard of, and I do hope that we do see in the coming months or the coming years sort of a domino effect by which some other would follow suit.
Which is being widely touted by the White House, by many, all involved, saying this is just the beginning. Ambassador Ettinger, I want your thoughts on the Prime Minister Netanyahu here is talking about, and he's not the first to say this, the end of the Palestinian veto on Israel's foreign relations here. Is he right, or is the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, are these outliers from the larger situation?
Well, the peace agreement with the UAE and Bahrain shed light on the reality of the Middle East. And this is not something new. You go back to the 1948-49 war, the war was over. Iraq occupied the northern West Bank, Samaria. It did not occur to the Iraqis to give it to the Arabs of the area. They transferred it to the Hashemite regime in Jordan. Jordan occupied the southern part of the West Bank, Judea, and once again, they did not transfer it to the Arabs in the area. They annexed it to the East Bank of Jordan, and in fact, they prohibited any political activity in that area. The Egyptians likewise with Gaza. They occupied Gaza, never occurred to them. And the Arab League established a Palestinian department which was erased from the Arab League in 1959. And since then until today, while the Arab talk has been very, very warm towards the Palestinians, the Arab walk reflected the reality. Namely, the Palestinian issue was never a top issue on the Arab agenda, and in fact, usually a negative element terrorizing and subverting Arab countries. And the recent agreements and the recent expansion of ties between Israel and every single pro-American Arab regime are testimony to the reality of the Middle East. The Palestinian issue is not a prerequisite for peace. The Palestinian issue has been an obstacle to peace, and today we see that reality coming to the forefront.
Professor Rabi, we heard the Prime Minister loudly heckled as he got into these elements of the discussion, talking about the Arab world's support, touching on the Palestinian position here. And as we know, the 15 members of the Arab Joint List will not vote in support of this peace deal based on solidarity with that. How large did that issue feature, but also taking into the context of Iran, which has also been just as large of a talking point here now. There's a section in the agreement, the strategic agenda for the Middle East part, the relations between these countries. Was the threat of Iran perhaps the most central element that bringing these sides together?
At the outset, definitely. I think that Iran has become a threat. I would even say, having been familiar with the way actually the paranoia of the Gulfians is working, for them Iran is an existential threat. And that actually provided sort of a common denominator, a wide common denominator between Israel and Arab Gulf states. But here is the added value. There is kind of a mutuality when it comes to economy, when it comes to advanced technology, when it comes to how to foster your future. And this is the people of the tomorrow. You know, having been familiar with actually the discourse there in the UAE, I can tell you, with kind of prudently, to put it prudently, what I see there is people who do think that religion and culture are not obstacles. You can glean from them some components by which to build up a bridgehead. And this is what's going on. And the Middle East is going through a geopolitical revolution. And I do hope that all these agreements will serve to further isolate the Iranian axis. If I may say, actually, what's going on between Lebanon and Israel, albeit on a different level, because this is a very, very mechanic agreement. But if you come to think of that, look at the Iranian proxy Hezbollah. He has nothing to say about what's going on now. Demarcation of the border is another way. Is another way to say that Israel is legitimate, and Israel is part and parcel of the Middle East. And this brings me actually to the final conclusion: when states, Arabs, are on the verge of a total collapse, economically speaking, or when other states, rich and wealthy in the Gulf, do think that what they have in mind is how to foster a better future for next generations, I guess they would find, and they have found, kind of a huge common denominator with Israel rather than Iran or radical Arab states.
Ambassador, the Prime Minister touched on that, talking about these maritime negotiations, but bringing to the picture the recent Chevron acquisition of Noble Energy, which he said would not have been possible while the Gulf states didn't provide this opening, that Chevron, Israel was too touchy of a subject for them to embrace. You may be right that this will now enable these major agreements, but along those lines, and what Professor Rabi is talking about here, this appears to be an agreement based on a friendly nature, a friendly agreement, a real ground up and bottom down nature of the agreement. Is that truly unprecedented for Israel? Have we seen anything like this in previous agreements or relations with regional states?
I would suggest to do away with the adjectives friendly, because this is not about friendship, it's about interests. Without inherent, intrinsic UAE and Bahrain interest, there wouldn't be an agreement. They don't do it because they like Israel. They don't do it because they want to live to coexist peacefully with Israel. They do it because they regard Israel as the most trusted life insurance agent in the entire region, especially when the U.S., which was not very reliable 4 years ago with the appeasement of Iran, the last 4 years became pretty reliable, but who knows what will happen comes January. In Israel, whether it's left of center or right of center government, they know they can rely on Israel. And to follow up on Professor Rabi's comments, I would say that when one talks about economic dividends, the major dividend, economic dividend for the UAE and for Bahrain and other Gulf Arab countries is the need to diversify their economies. To be based solely on oil does not bode well for the future with the declining price of oil, with the declining importance of oil. They need diversification, and they correctly regard Israel as a source of innovative technologies which could diversify their economy. And on top of that, they recognize Israel's stature in Washington specifically, throughout the U.S., and they believe that with Israel they can leverage the Israeli stature in America to benefit their own needs.
Exactly.